Africa is home to some of the fastest economic growth in the world, yet this growth isn't reflected in its air travel network. For example, Luanda is the capital city of Angola, which has a population of 2.8 million people. Dar es Salaam is the former capital and the most populous city in Tanzania with a population of 4.4 million people. They're just under 3,000 kilometers apart, yet there are no direct flights between them. If I wanted to go on a business trip and fly out on Monday returning on Friday, the cheapest fare via Addis Ababa with Ethiopian Airlines is £750 in economy. Now let's compare that to Europe. Kiev has a population of 2.8 million people and is the capital of Ukraine. Madrid is the capital of Spain and is home to 3.2 million people. There's a daily direct flight for £240 or a flight for £170 with a stopover in Istanbul. These routes are exactly the same distance. However, in Africa, you're paying 42 pence per mile, and in Europe, you're paying 13 pence per mile. That means aviation in Europe is 3 times cheaper than in Africa. Of course, there are many factors which go into pricing of flights and creating routes, but it's still an example which proves that aviation is not so common in Africa and is very expensive. Africa is home to 16% of the world's population, but only 2.1% of the global passenger kilometers flown by African airlines. In Europe or North America, the average person takes at least one round-trip flight each year. On the contrary, in Nigeria and Ethiopia, the average person takes one round trip every 50 years. Just look how sparsely populated this map of non-stop African flights actually is. However, Africa needs air travel more perhaps than any other continent. International and even regional road and rail connections are poor and sometimes don't even exist, but cities and train links are further apart. There are 44 cities with a population over 1 million in Africa and 36 cities over 1 million in Europe. But you just have to remember one thing: Africa is big. Cities in Europe, Asia and the US are just closer together than Africa. That means that the only viable method of transport in Africa is air transport. But if that's true, how come it's impossible to fly between two large cities for less than £750? Well, you see, the average African has to work 2.8 weeks to earn enough to buy a short round trip, or 6.6 weeks to buy a longer round trip ticket, whilst not even leaving the continent. Compare this to intra-EU travel, where the average person has to work just 2 days to buy a round trip ticket. So why are fares so high? Is labour not cheaper in Africa, and isn't it a cheaper place to run any business? That doesn't really stretch the aviation industry, unfortunately. Firstly, poor infrastructure means that actually getting fuel and parts to aircraft and airports is a challenge. It's difficult and expensive, driving up the operating costs for airlines. African airlines also tend to be incredibly cash tight when they launch, leading them to operate incredibly old and inefficient aircraft which guzzle fuel, again increasing the cost of operating the aircraft. The second reason is supply and demand. It shows how many seats are filled on African airlines versus North American airlines. The load factor fluctuates every year due to seasonal demand changes. For example, there's always a higher demand in summer. African airlines, shown by the red line, just can't seem to fill most of their seats. This means that they have to raise prices to compensate for the seats that they cannot fill. Another issue is that only 14 out of the 54 African countries offer visas on arrival to African nationals. This affects international business and also tourism. The African Tourism Monitoring Report suggests that visas liberalization would increase tourism between 5 and 25%. This would allow the creation of new hotels, restaurants and more, providing employment to 60% of the African youth who are currently unemployed. However, there's one factor which perhaps trumps the rest. There's almost no open skies agreement between African countries. This makes it much more difficult to open international routes in Africa than any other continent. This creates additional costs which are reflected in the ticket prices passengers have to pay. There's also considerable evidence which suggests that liberalization or the freeing of international air markets provides benefits for passengers and the wider economy. For example, the creation of the free air market between Kenya and South Africa in the early 2000s led to a 69% rise in passenger traffic. The Ethiopian government has enabled Ethiopian Airlines to become one of the largest and the most profitable airlines in Africa. This was achieved as a result of the government creating bilateral open skies agreements with whatever country they wanted to fly to. So, what progress is Africa making towards liberalization? The Single African Air Transport Market aims to open African airspace and also improve intra-African connectivity. 26 African countries have already signed up, dwarfing the 12 African countries that IATA said was necessary. It shows that the African governments are aware that aviation can spark economic growth. After all, that's what Africa needs: economic growth. This can be aided for no cost by liberalizing air markets, allowing African businesses to trade and bring in foreign investment, lifting many countries out of poverty. I believe that if Africa can achieve this, then the sky really is the limit for African aviation.